welcome conference will now be recorded.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Emily Hill. I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Canadian Ministries here at the Presbyterian Church in Canada National Office. A lovely part of my job is that I coordinate some of our leadership webinars, and I get to work with amazing leaders who are doing interesting new ministry in their areas. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our teacher today. So you will be on mute. If you could keep yourself on mute for the duration of the webinar, that just avoids some of the background noise that can distract from the presenters teaching. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, as you can see on your screen, this is being recorded. We just like you to know that because it will be posted on the web later and for other people to access. And we have quite a few people watching the webinars afterwards. So we just wanted you to know that. And there is a chat box that you will see in the corner. Throughout the webinar, I would invite you, if you have any questions, just to write them down in the chat box. I, as your host, will be keeping track of them. And at the end of the webinar, we'll leave some time and John will answer your questions. I'll bring them to him. So that's the easiest way we've found of doing things. So now I'd like to introduce John Gilbert, who is the clerk of the Presbytery of Grey Bruce Maitland. He is here today to share the experience that Presbytery had of starting a cooperative ministry. So I'm going to turn it over to John. I'm going to be turning off my webcam, so you won't see me until the end of the presentation again. But feel free to message me if you're having any issues. But thank you very much, John, and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope to be able to share with you today what led to the creation of a cooperative ministry here in this presbytery, how we got there, what we did, and where we are today, basically. So greetings from beautiful downtown Bruce and Grey counties in Ontario. I'm coming to you from the little town of Chesley, which is a gorgeous place to live. It's where I hang my hat. If I can get this working here now. Basically, I'm here hopefully today to talk to you primarily about solving problems. And the problems that we identified in our presbytery are no different than what my fellow clerks have shared with me over the years at the clerks' consultations, which are the problems that are being experienced by churches, both urban and rural, across probably all of Canada. Shrinking attendance, i.e. shrinking membership, shrinking givings, stewardship is down, increasing overheads are somewhat usually aged buildings and aged infrastructure in the buildings keeps going up year after year. The buildings themselves are aging. Many are needing tremendous work, which we see a lot of McBain-Barker applications going through from our smaller churches because they simply can't afford from their own resources to address the problems that they're having with their buildings. And of course, if you're looking at me on the webcam, you can see the color of my hair. I'm fairly stereotypical. Aging congregations. We are not seeing a flood of young people joining our congregations, and the people who are there to do the work are getting older like me. These problems are common, I think, to most churches, not just within our own denomination. And as I've been a member of other organizations down through the years, including Rotary International, I can attest to the fact that it's not only churches that are facing these problems today. Problems such as we are struggling with as churches are faced by almost any membership organization that is running this day. We've identified 4 main causes, and these come to me both from resources within our church, within the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and some of it have come to me basically from other organizations such as Rotary. There's what I call the 75-25/25-75 flip-flop. There's a sprinter versus marathoner switch. Some of you may have heard that before, and I'll explain why in a moment. There's that we've always done it that way rut. If you're in a church, you probably have heard that one. And there's the if only delusion. 75-25 flip-flop. Back in the 60s, 75% of the population in Canada, we're told, attended church regularly on a Sunday, and 25% did not. Today, that number is reversed. Only 25% of people in Canada, according to the latest stats that I've been able to get my hands on, actually attend church on a regular basis on Sundays. 75% do not, for a great number of reasons. We found that that was exactly the same here in Grey Bruce. Now, sprinter versus marathoner. Anybody who's been to a Ken and Callahan 12 Keys to an Effective Church, Stewards by Design workshop will have heard that one. Today, millennials and younger, they're willing to do almost anything on a one-time basis or on a short-term basis. And they're willing to do lots of them, but don't ask them to join anything. They are the sprinters. Whereas folks my age and your age probably are the marathoners. We join for the long term, or at least for a longer term. In my day and age, you didn't join something unless you were prepared to devote some time and some effort to being part of it. The young people today, younger people today, are still willing to devote lots of time and effort, but it's short term. Many projects, nothing long term, tends to be the norm. That we've always done it that way. Arguably, this is one of the biggest obstacles that we identified when we looked at our churches and what were some of the roadblocks for staying healthy, getting healthy, staying alive. There's a huge reluctance to change. There's the if only delusion. If only we could attract more young families. If only everyone on the rolls would actually come to church. If only they didn't schedule hockey practice on Sunday mornings. If only, and you can fill in the blanks in your community. We can't change society, so if onlys simply are statements of what we can't do. So we came up with the Grey Bruce Maitland approach. We had some really wonderful people that put this together. I just happen to be part of the team, which is why I get the privilege of speaking to you today. At the time, we had 13 out of 26 charges totaling 35 churches that were vacant without a minister. Presently, we're down to 34 churches, and we have 2 more pending closures. That results, of course, in an extremely high need for intern monitors with far too human resources to fill those positions, which of course leads to clergy burnout and congregations at the brink, financially speaking. Our congregational challenges included these. These were the top ones that were identified. That resistance to change that I've already mentioned. In our case, our geography. We're huge. We're 2 very large counties that would take up countries in Europe. So we're geographically separate from each other. There are other more challenging places out west and places like that, but our churches are a long ways apart. And we're addicted to our buildings. We're not supposed to worship idols, but by gosh, we do worship our buildings because there's a lot of historical commitment to them and a lot of reasons for loving them. This is a two-edged sword, sadly. We're also addicted to full-time clergy. This has been the traditional model, where every church gets to have a dedicated minister who shows up every Sunday and who offers pastoral care throughout the week. We have long-standing vacancies in our presbytery. We have charges that we know will never be financially sound enough again to actually call a full-time minister, or perhaps some of them even to share a full-time minister. As alluded to earlier, there is denial as to the causes and the possible or likely outcomes, and denial as to how they should best be addressed. There's fear, there's apathy, and last but not least, there's what we refer to, and it's not a new term, analysis paralysis. Too many of our churches keep looking for the reasons, the excuses, and analyze themselves to death and never get on with actually doing anything to address the concerns that they have. What we did, and this is the short version, and I'll expand upon it. We formed a new standing committee. Not that we had that many people that we could afford to harvest people out of our existing committees to create a new one, but we had a need that we saw needed meeting desperately, urgently, so we created what was called the Spark team. I'll get to what that means in a minute. From there, we hosted a whole series of guest speaker workshops to help equip our congregations to recognize both their predicaments and to understand the options that they had and the potential they had for changing and addressing their needs. We also used every educational component at our presbytery meetings for over a year to address this issue, in terms of adding that on top of our special speaker workshops, which were usually held on Saturdays in a central location. Then, once we identified the 7 churches most urgent in need who actually seemed to be willing to discuss the project, we started a dialogue with the 7. Now, some of the guest speaker workshops that we held on Saturdays included the ones that are on your screen now. We had Reverend John Peter Schmidt, and he, Facing the Future with Joy and Confidence was the name of his workshop. This quite literally lit our people on fire, especially in those 7 congregations, and gave them a measure of confidence to actually take steps forward. Bill Bickle, Natural Church Development. Every church in our presbytery, all 34 at the time, undertook natural church development, except for one who had just done it the year before themselves. We got Bill involved. We brought in Reverend Christine O'Reilly, and she gave us a workshop called Renewing the Rural Church. We brought in Reverend Keith Boyer, and he provided a workshop called Congregational Development and Revitalization. We did our best to give our people the best advice and the best tools, or knowledge of the best tools they could reach out and use to help themselves. The Spark team, the name Spark, unfortunately, the wonderful woman who was on our committee, who was one of our real drivers, Mary, she's passed away now, but she came up with the name Spark, and it stands for Spirit-Led, Presbytery-Wide, Acting Together with Resources for Renewal to Kindle the Flames of Faith. Presbyterians are never short-winded, and this is why we reduced it to the acronym SPARK. And it has stuck, and we are still an existing committee, and we are still working with congregations, assisting them where and when we can. The process that we chose for seeking renewal within the willing congregations, we led a presbytery-wide visioning process introduced at a presbytery meeting and followed up. This process involved all congregations engaging in a study, a self-study, to discern their own strengths and their own areas that were ripe for development. And we called that asset inventories. It's something we stole from the healthcare sector. And we went on to continue to work with those congregations who were interested in possibly finding out what might or could be done through a cooperative ministry. We also initiated regional planning tables because we have such a very large presbytery geographically. Not all areas could be treated under the same umbrella. It was best to regionalize it to address local needs as they saw it. We sponsored, as I mentioned, Natural Church Development, the NCD program, for all our congregations. We researched, we discussed, and we planned for ways that we could help to facilitate willing congregations to develop viable collaborative ministries, which we called co-ops. And we finally ended up initiating intentional collaborative discussions between 7 churches initially. The visioning process was meant to articulate the desired future as an organization fulfilling its mission. It described in present tense as if it were a reality. A process like this can and should be used to identify gaps between the current state of affairs and the desired future state, so you can really hone in and zero in on the areas for improvement. What it allowed us to do is provide a focus to direct our present activity and move in a consistent direction. Visioning has become a mantra that everyone uses, from corporations to churches to every organization I've been involved with. And sometimes when you say the word visioning, people's eyes glaze over. But without a sincere visioning process, our worries were that opportunities would be missed, that actions would be reactive rather than creative or proactive, that the decisions without buy-in would not be widely supported. We also saw tremendous potential for misunderstanding, ineffective communication, and conflict unless there were a sound, well thought out vision process that people had already bought into. And most of all, we were concerned that unless we had a clear vision that everyone shared in creating and supported, that we might not end up where we wanted to be. Where do you want to go? Mary Silver was the woman I referred to who has left us, sadly. At one of our presbytery workshops, she asked that question, and she used a well-known children's story. And she shared that one day Alice came to a fork in the road, and she looked and she saw above her a Cheshire cat up in a tree. Which road do I take? Alice asked the cat. Where do you want to go? Was the cat's reply. I don't know, Alice answered. Then the cat very wisely said, then it doesn't matter. Thank you to Lewis Carroll. You need to know where you want to go to get where you're going. What's up on the screen now is one of the asset inventory sheets that we had all our congregations fill out. It was a study to discern their strengths and areas for development. We called it asset inventories, and it really did, more than anything else that I've seen, it allowed people in our individual congregations to discover and to appreciate the strength that they did have to build upon and to work with, be it by themselves or in cooperation with other congregations. It's easy to know to believe what you are, but when you see it in black and white, when it's been listed and enumerated, it shows you your strengths and your areas of potential far better than chatting about it around a table. It was quite helpful. Then we started working with the interested congregations. We held numerous meetings with sessions with multiple congregations. Some of these were individual and others were in groups of like interest and of like geographic proximity. This eventually led to the selecting of the 7 most in need and most likely to be able to cooperate congregations in a collaborative ministry type of dialogue. We initiated the regional planning tables I mentioned. Congregations formed into geographical, logical discussion groups to determine if there could be a meeting of people to work together. And we facilitated discussions about every possible option for cooperative ministry, because there's no one size fits all. Some of the options for cooperative ministry include shared administration, overhead, a singular office, a one person answering the phone for numerous churches, printing done in all one place, things of that nature. Shared administration is something we stole and suggested from the corporate sector. We also looked at the possibility of mergers. We've had mergers in this presbytery. They're not always the most ideal thing, but in the right circumstances, they certainly can work. We looked at pulpit exchange. We looked at amalgamations. We looked at the existing model for clusters. We discussed lay worship leaders, and the list went on and on. There's a number of things. There was lots of things brought up, lots of things proposed, lots of things chewed on at these meetings. The natural church development was, I think, from my own personal observations, was a good underlying tool to get people thinking in the right direction. Bill Bickle's program really is designed to assist churches to become healthier. And we did. We required all the churches to undertake this program. And it's not a free program, it's rather expensive. But we did have the good fortune of having some money set aside in an account that wasn't earmarked for anything. And we chose as a presbytery to pay half the cost out of the presbytery's coffers towards the cost of each congregation participating. And I think that helped us get over the hump of the resistance to wanting to spend money when we were dealing with struggling congregations, that finances were one of their main concerns. We researched, we discussed, we planned, we looked at anything we could to develop and discuss ways to help willing congregations pursue any form of cooperative ministry. As I said, we initiated discussions between 7 particular churches, and we mandated those 7 churches to work with us. We led numerous discussions and planning meetings, and what it came down to in the end was that 4 of the original 7 signed on to go ahead bravely and form a cooperative ministry. I think there was a key factor. I think the tipping point for the 4 congregations that signed on to become a co-op was they changed their individual perspectives as to what was reality. They weren't buying into any of the old models. They were looking forward for the first time, probably, to what could be, as opposed to worrying about what had always been. They came to understand, is how I like to say it, they came to understand that they had to work with what they have, not wish and pine for what they used to have, not unrealistically wish that society would do a 180 and things would go back to the way they were in the 60s. They had to realize that the whole, cooperatively, is greater than the sum of its parts. And they had to realize that working cooperatively, they could gain much more than they might lose. They could survive. The nuts and bolts. Now, I've presented an overview of the intentional process that we took to get where we are today. And if you want details, examples, specifics, even budgets and stuff that we used, offline and through email or whatever, I'd be more than pleased to share as much as I can to assist any of your presbyteries, any of your congregations start their work towards finding the type of renewal that 4 of our churches found, embarked on, and are still working through on a cooperative basis. Where did we start? Our first cooperative ministry started in 2015. At our presbytery meeting on March 10th in 2015, history was made in this presbytery by a motion being passed to create our first cooperative shared ministry. On your screen are the 4 brave congregations, and I do say brave because it certainly was a step outside of the norm. These 4 congregations chose to march ahead bravely and see what they could do together. The original model included 2 ministers, a called minister and 1 stated supply at 3/4. On the screen, you'll see that the ministers did a 4-week rotation of 1 and 2 points, leading worship in 3 out of 4 churches. Each church was self-led or used pulpit supply every 4th Sunday. They also embarked on shared ministry events, shared anniversary service celebrations. That was pretty cool. When one of the 4 churches would have a celebration on a particular Sunday of their anniversary, the other 3 churches would come and not have ministry in their own church and swell the church to practically, 1960s version. And they would get together with their youth programs in the summer. They would do music events, shared choir events. They did ministry with our local First Nations people on summer programs. They did all sorts of things that none of them could have done on their own. Present co-op, we've had a change. That was 4 years ago. 3 years into the program, one of the ministers, the called minister, took a call somewhere else. It happens so often in our denomination. So now we transitioned our stated supply minister, transitioned into a full-time call, and he works now with the 4 churches on still a 4-week rotation. And as you can see, week 1 on the east side and west side, there's 2 churches on the east side of our presbytery, 2 churches on the west side of our presbytery. Week 1, ministers on the east side, the west side is run by the session, self-led. Week 2, the session is self-led on the east side, minister on the west side, west side, and so on down the list. There was a little trepidation initially, but within the sessions and the congregations of actually leading service themselves without pulpit supply. Pulpit supply, as you see, is part of that mix. But they've done it well, and they seem to have done it happily once they got into it. The minister shares his message, shares the order of service, and helps them with their individual order. They're not all exactly the same. All 4 churches are still independent, and I should go back to that, but and I will in a minute. But the self-led has worked out well. So they either have one of 3 things. They have a minister showing up on the Sunday. He does 2. Or they have a pulpit supply person coming in, or they lead the ministry themselves on a given Sunday with the materials and resources that are supplied with the new resources supplied by their called minister. What I should note is none of these churches gave up their independence. They all retained, quite literally, they are still 4 independent churches with their original sessions, but each session appoints 2 individuals from the session to sit on a co-op steering committee. And the steering committee works together like a session over sessions, although it has no actual, has no legal existence under our polity. It works as an ad hoc committee over the 4 sessions to work through cooperative opportunities, work through cooperative problems, et cetera, and communicate what they think is the best way forward back to their individual sessions, and it's worked extremely well. There has been no animosity and no problems that I'm aware of. So where are we today? Well, after those 4 churches got up and going, we have continued, and we are still continuing. Initially, we held talks with 6 other churches in the southeast corner of our presbytery. Those talks went on and off for about a year. Really positive discussion, but in the end, it didn't form a co-op. But I think as a result of the discussion, the churches involved are far more better equipped to go ahead individually until they choose to do something else. We also initiated discussions between 7 other churches in the southwest corner of our presbytery, and those discussions even involved our wonderful children's summer camp, Camp Kintail, on the shores of Lake Huron. No, we have not had any further co-ops yet, but I think we have an increased healthy attitude towards cooperative ministry as a result of our ongoing efforts. So what does it look like? When I was asked what I have seen throughout the 4 churches that are in our existing co-op, I came up with a description that I hope you can relate to. I live, as I said, in Chesley, Ontario. It's one of the 4 small villages where one of the co-op churches is located. Now, I see members of the congregation here in Chesley almost every day. It's a small town. I see them at the grocery store. I see them at a post office. We don't have postal delivery. We have post boxes. See them at the post office, and, dare I say, I see them at the liquor store and other places. So I see people here every day and know who they are. Now, before the co-op, I say this quite sincerely, even though it's tongue-in-cheek, when I would meet members of the local congregation out in the community, it was almost always the same thing. I would exchange the usual rural Canadian greeting saying, "Hi, how are you?" And the response I would usually get would remind me of the children's story, Winnie the Pooh, or at least part of that story. The response would remind me something of what Eeyore might say. "Oh, we're not too bad. We're not dead yet." And that's not a joke. That was pretty much as excited as the local people would get when you'd see them, because they identified me as clerk of presbytery, and they were relaying to me just the state of the union for their congregation. But that has changed. Today, people are happy. They're optimistic, and sometimes they're downright excited. Now they see hope where before they could only see likely or certain death. Now they see a future with potential where before they could only dwell on past glories. We are trying to support our co-op, and they're supporting themselves. Mary, who I've referred to a few times, referred to it as moving forward with joy and confidence, with purpose, with passion, with good practices. She shared that that will help us become the church that Christ is calling us to be. Whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And I'm stealing that both from the Bible and Dr. John Peter Schmidt, from his article in the Presbyterian Record in May 2013. You can look that up. Good article. The scary part of the Presbyterians, there's not much different than any other denomination in Canada. Everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. And I found all sorts of cartoons I could have put in here, but I chose this. Despite the math, change in our churches is a 4-letter word for most of us. Now, you don't have to change. The saying goes, survival isn't mandatory. I tried to find an author for that, but I couldn't. But I would like to suggest the status quo certainly is not a solution. But the good news is that Jesus knows his way out of the tomb. And I'm quoting Reverend Christine O'Reilly from our workshop on church renewal. It's come to that time for questions, and I'd like to take a moment just to thank you for your interest in possibly going down the cooperative route. It has proved a way of staying viable because 3 of the 4 churches that are in our particular co-op were very precariously positioned going into the co-op, and they're still hanging on. Are they still precarious? To some extent, yes, but they are living now with hope and with thankfulness that they just didn't have before. I think they will get both quality and quantity of years in service to Christ out of their efforts under Cooperative. I'll share with you in closing one of my very favorite sayings, and I've said this since I was a kid back in university. Life is not always the party we had hoped for, but while we're here, we might as well dance. And what we told the people who were in those 4 congregations, if you're willing to dance, we are willing to help.
Wow.
And that's pretty much me, Emily.
Thank you, John. That was so informative and also inspiring to see where you've come. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We don't have any in so far, but I do have a question. So looking at it from this end of things, when we hear, oh, we went through this step and this step and this step, it can feel a little bit daunting. Like I can imagine people looking at this and wondering, oh my, how long did this process take you? That would be my first question. Like, how long was it from when the beginning of the conversations happened and until the co-ops, the churches decided to become a co-op? And then the other question I had was, what would be first steps? Whether you're in a presbytery where that you might want to be considering this option, or whether you're an individual church and you're thinking, geez, the co-op might be a good solution. What would be a first sort of step?
The how long was slightly over a year from the time we began the dialogue till we got down to the hard text and actually formed the first co-op in 2015. We started late 2013, worked all the way through 2014. And like I say, during the best part of a full presbytery year, we developed 4 workshops that were actually held here in Chesley because I'm geographically central within our presbytery. We bribed people shamelessly. We offered them roast beef on a bun, hot dinners for $5, and we subsidized the cost out of our presbytery coffers, and we filled the community center with over, I think our largest attendance was over 75 people, and I think our lowest was still over 50 for those 4 different workshops. We held those throughout that presbytery year preceding the forming of the co-op, but also during that formative year, we devoted intentionally the educational component of every presbytery meeting to matters underlining and undergirding the concept of cooperative ministries. And that included your second question, the first steps. The first steps really was getting people past the hurdle of oh, we can't do that. We don't have enough to do that. We got people to do those inventories, asset inventories that I referenced, where they could see, despite the deficiencies they were suffering and experiencing, those inventories also gave them the opportunity to see the strengths that they had that many of them really didn't understand, not even from their own terms. They had no idea how well those strengths could dovetail with other congregations in consideration of cooperative ministry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It sounds like the work was a lot about beginning by shifting the culture, like this culture of we can't do, or we always want to be the same. And those cultural shifts are not easy to do. And it seems like you went about it in the right way by feeding people, literally and spiritually, but also having these great speakers come in. We do have a question that's come into the chat box now. Let me see.
I see that.
Yeah.
Children of the future. I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, and I get to see in my very fortunate position as clerk of presbytery, and the fact that I do lay pulpit supply occasionally, I get to see almost all of our congregations one time or another. We have very few churches that have any significant number of children, and it's less and less. We have one exception to that, and it's a rural church, quite literally in the middle of nowhere. They wouldn't appreciate that reference, but they are. As rural a church as you'll ever find anywhere in Canada. And there's about 40 odd people, and you stand up in the front of the church in the pulpit on a Sunday morning staring back at you, and over half of those people, well over half, are children. So after the children's message and the time together with the children, you excuse them to go to Sunday school, you wonder who left the door open, because all of a sudden the place looks empty. The cooperatives have worked very hard, and those 4 churches are not one of the blessed churches in which lots of people are bringing kids. One of the things they've done to attract kids is Vacation Bible School. They've done on a cooperative basis so they can devote more and better and enhanced resources, and they, bus kids and everything else to a cooperative Vacation Bible School. Another thing they've done is one of the 4 churches has worked with the other 3 in cooperation with the First Nations community that is right next door to that one particular church, in having youth events and other events. So they've reached out to children best they can in those ways, but we do have churches, quite literally, where there are no children on a Sunday morning. That one church I did mention, I'll share something that I find telling, sadly. Although there are well over 20 kids often in that church on a Sunday morning, only 2 of them that I'm aware of come with their parents. The rest actually come with their grandparents who age like with me. So I'm not sure, maybe we can encourage grandparents to bring more children out. I know in my own church, and I don't actually, except on sometimes intentionally I go to the church here in Chesley, but I've been a member for 30 years of the church, of our Presbyterian Church, Knox Church over in Walkerton, where I lived before I moved here 8 years ago. In my own church, there's 4 to 6, sometimes 8 kids come on a Sunday morning, and almost, not all, but almost half of those come with grandparents, not with parents. So I think that is a trend. I'm not sure. I'd like to think it's an opportunity. I just don't know how that can be worked out. But no, children are very much something that is a focus of the cooperative ministry, and they're still trying to work their way through it. I notice there's another question there. Could we have access to the asset inventory? I'd be glad to print some PDFs or whatever form I still have of that off and email them to Emily, and she could make them available on the website, or however that can be done.
Yeah, definitely. We can make that available. We can make that available. Do we have any other questions to come in? One thing, we do have a few more minutes. So I was wondering, I know in these talks that you had at the beginning, because I know many of the people who gave them, that they would have been very focused on discerning where God was calling you. So how do you think the Spirit moved in this work? Because when you said that it's actually only a year that it really took, I thought that's quite amazing to move from one place to another like that for 4 congregations in a year. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about spiritually how you were feeding people at that time, or how you were getting people to turn to God. And I ask this because I think sometimes we in our lives, but also in our churches, approach things from a head perspective, like, oh, I'm going to solve this problem through my own will and through my own, and then we start planning and we forget that part about turning to God. And I think with what you've done, this could only have worked, this new model, by God being brought in. So how did that happen?
I'd like to take credit for it, but I can't. I would suggest that the change in mindset occurred primarily through the wonderful speakers that we were fortunate enough to invite and to actually accepted our invitations. As I mentioned, Reverend John Peter Schmidt led a workshop for us. Reverend Christine O'Reilly led a workshop for us, and Reverend Keith Boyer led a workshop for us. Those three people in particular, to use an overused term these days, got people thinking outside the box. Let God speak to you. Let him tell you how you can work with what you've got. Don't sit there pining for the pastor, hoping that a floodgate's going to come in on Sunday morning from the hockey arena. That's my words, not theirs. Mm-hmm. But I think those three people did more in a very short time, you're right, 1 year, to get people thinking differently than they had in the past than we could have ever done with 1 million programs. They were, anyone who has heard them knows they are wonderfully spirit-led people. They were, as a leader of a workshop is called, they were truly true facilitators.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got a couple more in. Any thoughts on being able to move congregations and people beyond a merely survival mentality? So what does it take to move people?
It depends. I mean, some churches sadly are so far eroded that a good death is the best they can hope for. We've already, in my short tenure, it's 10 years as clerk, we've had three churches, close on my watch, and I'm aware of 2 more that are going to close in the next short while. So we're going to, in 10 years, have moved from 37 churches down to 32. And the ones that have closed, the communities in which they're situated simply could not, even in the 60s probably, have survived with the present population base. In this area, we're predominantly rural. We're almost 100% agricultural, beautiful farm area. But most farms today are corporate. There's darn few farms actually have a house sitting on them anymore. They're just 100 acres of land and some rubble where a house used to be. So it's corporate farming. It's a change in industry. The only people moving into our area and actually settling on farms don't go to denominational churches. They're the Mennonites and the Amish. And they are buying up a lot of our farms, but they obviously don't contribute to the health of our denominations. It's not going to happen. I noticed another question there. Where can we find more detail about the Spark team, its vision, plan of action, and whatnot? I can probably also send Emily some information, backgrounders on that, as much as I can reduce into some form that can be emailed.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I don't have the type of experience that John has, but in my role here at Canadian Ministries, we often work with congregations and about how to move people beyond a merely survival mentality. I think that one of the first steps is a return to thinking about the abundance of God and what God is actually calling us to. So we have this faith that's based on death and resurrection, but we don't always want to face the death part. And I'm not saying the death of a particular church or anything, and so I think that a lot of churches, a good first step is to really return to those spiritual practices of connecting with God and not being afraid of preaching about the fact that you are seeking God's will for your congregation and a new vision. I just think intentional spiritual practices around connecting with God is one way that I've seen churches begin that process of shifting the mentality, so that we're reminded that God is good and God is faithful to us, and that God is the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to last until the end of time. And so what is God calling us to do? How are we meant to be bearers of that gospel? So I see a lot of churches, and if anybody has any more questions beyond the cooperative model of ministry, you can certainly are welcome to be in contact with us here at Canadian Ministries. You can look us up on the PCC webpage. My supervisor, Jen DeCombe, who's the Associate Secretary of Canadian Ministries, she often does a lot more work like this with churches around renewal and visioning and that kind of stuff. So we'd be happy to help with some ideas about how to move beyond that survival mentality, because we get that question a lot, not just related to cooperative ministry or other models of ministry. So we can have that further conversation if you'd like, anybody. So do you guys have, yes.
Sorry. I was going to say, Emily's comments, your comments, Emily, have sparked me into remembering something that I've woefully forgotten, is to thank Canadian Ministries, because they were stalwart supporters of the co-op, both financially and otherwise, to get it on its feet and help it in so many ways. I know the two ministers, Randy Benson and Timothy Ferrier, who were the founding two ministers within the co-op, worked with Jen and your part of the PCC, Canadian Ministries, closely. Can't say enough good things about you guys. Wonderful to work with.
Thank you. And the other thing that came to mind is some of our other webinars, if you look on the previous webinar section of the page, the PCC website, not all of them are directly about change or how to inspire that, but there's a lot about visioning and working with your congregation to get to to discern where God is calling you. And so some of those might be helpful. But yes, we're always happy to hear from people at Canadian Ministries. So feel free to get in touch with us. If we don't have any other questions, we're still before 2, but I think it's okay to sign off. I know that both John and I would be happy to hear from you with further questions, and we'll try to get that information that you've asked for sent out to you and up on the website.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So thank you so much, John. It's been a real pleasure. I've been a fan of the cooperative ministry and heard a lot about it since I started my work here 2.5 years ago. So it's been a real pleasure to hear the backstory. And I know that many on this webinar have also greatly appreciated hearing about this journey. And we're so glad that God has blessed your presbytery in this way. And thank you for your work with them.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Also, thanks to everybody who attended. We know it takes a lot out of your busy ministry schedule and busy life schedule to come to do some continuing education like this. So we recognize that you've made a little bit of a sacrifice, and we thank you. And if you have any questions about cooperative ministry or any other forms of ministry, we would be happy to hear from you. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Bye for now.
Bye.